It's recently come to my attention that people are actually listening to this show. So, with that in mind, I'd like to offer a shamelessly self-serving disclaimer. I've wanted to talk about this week's topic for a long time. For a while, I thought it would be an essay, maybe an interview. But a while ago, when I started having the idea for a podcast, I thought, well, that'll be a perfect episode. The topic of today's show is the utterly fucked up poetry book contest system. So it was a very pleasant and inconvenient surprise when I won a poetry book contest this fall. I've decided, exercising characteristically consistently poor judgment, to go ahead and do this show anyway, because the poetry book contest system is really fucked up. But before doing that, I'd just like to say David Yetzi, who chose my book this fall, is an absolutely honest, talented, and accomplished man. I've already recommended his work on this show, so I won't dig back into that. But I have not yet recommended his beard, which is really outstanding. And the ditto Rob Griffith, who's publishing the book. And finally, also Alex Pepple, who published my first book and runs Able Muse, as well as the delightfully catty and incestuous and really erudite and insightful formalist online poetry forum Erratosphere. Alex is a prince among men, and with that, let's get to the profoundly ill-advised show. Several years ago, I won a poetry prize. It was not a huge deal poetry prize, but it was exciting to me at the time. And I met some people who were excited for me. I took it very seriously. I had taken the manuscript I submitted very seriously, and I thought I had done a good job. I thought I'd written something good, and it had been recognized for its value and selected as the winner. Now, several months after I won, I was at a writing conference, and it probably doesn't require any firsthand experience to guess that much of the time spent at any writing conference is occupied with just ruinous quantities of alcohol. This one was no different. I happened to come into a room and meet the fairly well-known poet. I had known of him from many years before. The fairly well-known poet who had chosen my poetry for this prize. I was excited to meet him. He did remember my work, and I was probably overeager for some kind of additional validation. But he didn't require much prompting. As soon as he realized who I was, he leapt to tell me the story of the selection of my work, which should have been thrilling to me, and initially was. He said, "Oh, I got the final selections, and I read through them, and I just found it so hard to pay attention, and I found all this very boring, and I was halfway through yet another one of these, and then I saw that here was a poem that included the word semen." And I thought, well, gosh, when is the last time I saw semen in a poem? So I figured, hey, why the hell not give it to this guy? And that, of course, was my semen poem. And he told me this as if it were some sort of good news. I was initially a little stung, by the realization that the selection of my work had been basically an arbitrary whim. But, on reflection, I remembered that this really just confirmed my working theory of prizes and desert, which is to say, very seldom do the people who deserve a prize get it. And on the rare occasions when they do, and again, I still think I did good work. I have a little pride in my output in poetry. But when the people who deserve a prize actually get it, my sort of iron rule is that they never get it because they deserve it. That their desert of the prize is in fact a coincidence. Now, I should say, I don't mean to make any specific accusations about any specific prizes, recent or otherwise, but I do think that generally speaking, and maybe especially in poetry, where the stakes are relatively low and the criteria are become ever more mystified, I think that if you are so lucky as to get something that you think that you deserve, then just be grateful that it worked out that way and don't think too hard about why things turned up for you, because chances are, upon examination, it's going to be some fucking coincidence and not the angels finally smiling upon you and elevating you and illuminating the deep and innate virtue of your work for the benefit of the world. Probably some guy just slipped on a fucking banana peel. I'm Matthew Buckley Smith, and you are listening to SLEERICKETS, a podcast about poetry and other intractable problems. This is, I think, a pretty juicy episode that I've got for you today. But before we get into that, I just wanted to make a quick note. A few of you have written in with suggestions or corrections, observations. There were some typos in the show notes to one of the episodes, and one listener mentioned that he thought that one of the reasons that regarding my discussion of y'all in the Poetry Voice episode, he thought one of the reasons that the word y'all might be gaining popularity among non-Southerners, apart from the popularity of rap music, could simply be the grammatical convenience of a gender-neutral second-person plural, in contrast to the conventional northern you guys. I thought that was smart. I thought it made sense. I was glad to hear it. So I just want to encourage all of you, if you notice something that I get wrong or miss, or something you wish that I would cover, or someone you'd like to hear interviewed, please do write in and let me know. The email address is sleerickets@gmail.com. That's SLEERICKETS @gmail.com. I would love to hear from you. And now let's get to the good part. Tonight, we're going to talk about poetry. That is, poetry with an F. For those who are not familiar with the term, poetry.com was a website launched on April Fool's Day, 2004, and it shut down a little over 3 years later, on May 18th of 2007. In that time, it caused a pretty big stir in the small and fussy poetry world. It was covered in Poets and Writers, in the Boston Globe, in the Los Angeles Times, in the New York Times, overseas in the Guardian. Janet Holmes of the Asada Press threatened to sue the editor of the site, the anonymous editor. It was an anonymously run site. Threatened to sue him and took action to try to get the site forcibly taken down. Ben Ramke was forced to step down as editor of the Contemporary Poetry Series at the University of Georgia as a result. Scott Cairns was forced to step down as the editor of the Vassar Miller Prize Series. Matthew Zapruder said, quote, "The people who run the site have consistently used fear-mongering and an accuse first, ask questions later method and contribute to the very system of hierarchy and secrecy that they so object to." And Jorie Graham, who was the most famous and perhaps most thorough victim of the site, or target, depending on how you see things. She referred to the website's tactics as equivalent to lynching. And then she announced that she would never judge another contest in her life. And to my knowledge, she has not. So what was this little website founded by a Portland Community College librarian all about? Well, in order to understand poetry, you have to understand the poetry book contest system. For a few decades now, and more as the years go by, in order to get a first book published, a first poetry collection published, except for a few flukish alternatives, it is and this is even more the case now than it was when poetry was up. It is basically necessary to win a book contest. These are contests run by usually small presses, since the major publishers publish a very, very small amount of poetry, but poetry really just doesn't sell. It just doesn't sell unless you're talking about Rupi Kaur or maybe Amanda Gorman's inaugural poem. For the most part, though, poetry is doesn't make for even a marginal business proposition. So it's small presses, often university presses or tiny independent presses that publish books of poems. And these presses very often run annual book contests, which is to say that once a year, dozens, sometimes hundreds or even thousands of aspiring poets, I was about to say young, but that is often not even remotely accurate in describing the entrants. So dozens, hundreds of aspiring poets send in manuscripts of poetry collections along with a contest fee. Usually this is about $25-$35. Sometimes a little lower, sometimes a little higher, but almost all of them fall into that range. One manuscript is selected as the winner. Usually the winner receives a pretty nominal cash prize. And of course, the main reward is getting your book published. So this is obviously a pretty frustrating way to try to go about getting published. Now, it is only more frustrating if it turns out that the judges of these prizes are, in fact, simply awarding them to their friends, their colleagues, their students, and in some cases, even their spouses. And that, in 2004 through 2007, or especially in the very beginning of poetry's run, that is exactly what was fucking happening. That is exactly what was happening. and that was poetry's reason for being. I keep saying poetry instead of poetry, and I suspect that I will continue to make that transposition. It's ridiculous, but sorry. Poetry.com's motto was exposing fraudulent contests, tracking the sycophants, naming names. And it's really the naming names part that I think got people so heated, because it, as you know, I'm going to read a few articles written about poetry at the time, but as one of the professors interviewed notes, this is not really a secret. Everybody has always sort of known this. The scandal is specifically pointing out individual perpetrators of this nepotism, embarrassing people. Really, that was poetry's big weapon, because despite some of the there was not just one person in charge. There was a founder, but then there ended up being multiple editors, and poetry also had an associated forum. So there were a lot of people who participated, and more than a couple called for criminal charges to be brought against some of these poetry figures. That was never really on the table. What was, and what poetry excelled at, was publicly embarrassing people whose careers were really sort of a fabric of tissue thin, artistic fancy and vague academic reputation above all. I mean, reputation, prestige is really, that's the real currency in poetry, because there is almost no other currency available to people who trade in poetry. So to get as specific as possible about how the editors of poetry saw the poetry world and what they were after, I want to read two selected paragraphs from their website. They were they were not, and never have been, and continue, as I'll get to later, not to be especially concise, but I'm trying to excerpt as best I can. So here are a couple choice paragraphs from the original poetry.com. They refer to PoBiz, which should be pretty self-explanatory. It's a favorite term of theirs. It is always derogatory and referring to the poetry business, PoBiz. So this is poetry.com. Ultimately, we believe that the PoBiz is foisting mediocre poetry upon poetry readers by monopolistic might, and that not only its practices, but its ideologies undermine the quality of the art form. We see the PoBiz as anti-literary, in that it uses the currency of poetry to provide short-term benefits, monetary, career, fame, comfort, etc., to a privileged and underrepresented elite, at the expense of generating and disseminating literature of lasting worth for the culture as a whole. We think poetry should be a reflection of and addition to the entire culture, not simply a currency used by a tiny percentage of the population to obtain goods and status for themselves alone. So that's sort of their diagnosis of the problem. This will come back too. I think Alan Cordle, which is the name of the founder, as he remained anonymous for about a year, and then after a pretty intense and collaborative effort by poetry's detractors, he was outed, not by choice. But his name was Alan Cordle, and Cordle's vision of the poetry world, his wife, the poet Kathleen Halm, had actually been a previous winner of one of the contests he most famously attacked, There is no indication that I've seen anywhere from any party that in her case the choice was influenced by any personal relationships. But his Cordle's understanding of the poetry world was not just that it was crooked, but that there were real prizes, real stakes for these choices. That is, that the unjustly rewarded friends and lovers of these judges were receiving prizes, prestige, positions, teaching, lecturing, entry into the reading circuit. That these people were really getting sort of major careers out of this crooked system of selection. And so it wasn't just that some people were getting their feelings hurt. It was that despite the flimsiness of poetry in our culture today, the flimsy role of poetry, I should say, in our culture, the associated, the secondary elements of this chosen life could actually be really significant, and that in his view, the crookedness of these prizes really made the difference between having and not having a viable, and in some cases a major prestigious career. The beneficiary of one of Jorie Graham's more questionable selections went on to a position at Harvard. So these were not. This was not a penny ante game in Cordle's view. I think that was maybe one of his first errors, or at least it was less and less accurate as time went on. But I want to get to the next paragraph from Poetry.com, because this is where he really gets into what they hope for, what they're after with all of this. We understand that any evaluation of artistic merit in the context of a poetry contest is largely a matter of the personal taste of the judge or judges. Poetry.com accepts this aesthetic taste as a valid ultimate criterion for judgment of manuscripts in poetry contests. What we would like to see is a contest that is sufficiently regulated and transparent so that it guarantees this ultimate criterion of judgment to all paying entrants. That is, we would like to see contests we would like contests to be assayable by each entrant based on this criterion, so that an entrant is able to estimate on the basis of potential aesthetic compatibility between her, him, and the judge. And that is a just unfucking believably loaded parenthetical. That parenthetical is, in my opinion, actually the whole ball game. As I'm going to repeat it one more time. Let me start from the beginning of the sentence so we can get the whole context. But this parenthetical is the dispositive, decisive question in this whole fucking mess. That is, we would like contests to be assayable by each entrant based on this criterion, so that an entrant is able to estimate on the basis of potential aesthetic compatibility between her, him, and the judge whether sending money to the contest is a worthwhile venture. The odds of winning any contest should be as estimable as possible, and that is not the correct use of the word estimable, or it is at best an unusual application of that word. He means here it should be as easy as possible to estimate whether you have a chance of winning a contest, because you should know who is choosing the winner and on what basis that person is choosing the winner. Again, that is a much taller order than one might expect. I also want to read, and this is, I'll warn you, pretty brutal. This is the poetry entry on Jorie Graham. It's not that long, but it is effective And it was effective, and it ends on a pretty damning note. I have a lot more to say about this, but for right now, I just want to read. This was what Poetry.com, with little to no warning, posted publicly. They did this for many, many other poets as well. Posted publicly as a reference for Jorie Graham, for figures in the poetry world. So this is the Jorie Graham entry. Most of it begins with sentences lopped off after the implied subject, Jorie Graham. Jorie Graham taught at Iowa Writers' Workshop and is now at Harvard. Selected her student, Joshua Clover, as winner of the Walt Whitman Award, which has since changed its guidelines. Selected her student, Michelle Glazer, as winner of the Associated Writing Program's award series in poetry in 1997, which prompted AWP to change its guidelines. Glazer, who studied with Graham at the Iowa Writers' Workshop, was awarded the Iowa Poetry Prize for her second book. Again, the implied Jorie Graham chose her student, Jeffrey Nutter, as winner of the Colorado Prize in 1999. Jorie Graham picked Iowa graduate James McCorkle for the American Poetry Review / Honickman First Book Prize in Poetry, published by Copper Canyon Press. Jorie Graham awarded the 2004 Barnard Women Poets Prize to her former student, Tessa Rumsey, whose first book was selected for the Georgia Contemporary Poetry Series by Jorie's ex, James Galvin. Quote, "It's hard to imagine how one could be a better teacher of poetry than she is," says Mark Levine, a former student who now teaches at Iowa himself. He must have been a very good student, as Graham picked his first book for the National Poetry Series in 1992. Jorie Graham presented her husband / Harvard colleague, Peter Sachs, with the Georgia Contemporary Poetry Series prize for his book. He was not, not that it matters that much, but he was not actually her husband at the time. He was soon to be her husband, but that is hardly exculpatory. A statement, this is the closing and I think damning note on the Jorie Graham entry. A statement adopted in competitions to prevent judges from selecting students is often referred to as the Jorie Graham rule. And this was, this is why Jorie Graham doesn't judge poetry contests anymore. Good God, why would she want to? I want to offer a little bit of a defense of Graham later. First, though, I just want to give you a slightly more thorough sense of how poetry affected the poetry world when it came out. So there is an especially histrionic piece by Stephanie Burt in the July 18th, 2004 edition of the Boston Globe. And it is presented as a piece of straight journalism. Boy, it's hard to read it as anything but an attack on poetry. Here's the headline: Poetry World Shocker, a muckraking website aims to blow the lid off the cozy practices of contemporary poetry. And here's the article. I'm just going to read the first two paragraphs. It goes on, and a lot of it is a little redundant. But here's the beginning. Does poetry need muckrakers? The secretive operators of the website Poetry, a self-described American poetry watchdog, certainly think so. They promise, from behind a cloak of anonymity, to uncover scandals among the publishers of contemporary poetry, dishing dirt on fraudulent contests, as their homepage has it, tracking the sycophants, naming the names, and generally cleaning house. The site has poets talking. Since its launch on April 1st, Poetry has racked up almost 600 comments and questions, from the laudatory to the outraged, at one point receiving 1,000 page views in a single day. Quite a crowd for gossip about new verse. These numbers may read a little differently now than they did in 2004. This was, this article came out just a couple months after the website debuted. Continuing on. The site has prompted vitriol elsewhere in cyberspace on various blogs and message boards. Poet and publisher Janet Holmes of Asada Press in Boise calls it repellent. California poet and blogger Eileen Tabios describes poetry as the dark side of the poetry world, while poet, critic, and publisher Kevin Waltzer of Word Tech Communications in Cincinnati complains that these guys see conspiracies everywhere and it's causing needless harm. I'll go down. There's another piece in the Los Angeles Times. So these next two pieces were published a year later. This was after Alan Cordle had been exposed as the founder of poetry. He and his partners did keep the site running for another couple years, but as we'll hear in the second of these or the third of these, the website may have already served its purpose. So this is from Website Upsets Poetry World. Librarians' Poetry Challenges Validity of Competitions by Tomas Alex Tison in the Los Angeles Times on July 17th, 2005. I'm going to skip down to the middle. He begins by sort of recapitulating Cordle's claim about how big a deal contests are and how he calls winning a contest one of the only sure tickets to continuing life as a poet, which sees that already as an overstatement. There's no sure tickets, and I don't think even then there were any. But let's skip down to a little further on. He says, as word spread, more people logged on to poetry, which Cordle says recorded more than 5,000 hits a day at one point. Among those who logged on or took part in discussions were some of the most respected bards in the land. Oof, man, don't say bards. Just bard is a word that should apply, if to anyone, then only to the one. It's just painful. Among those who logged on or took part in discussions were some of the most respected bards in the land, including former Guggenheim Fellow and Black Mountain poet Robert Creeley, Jorie Graham, and National Endowment for the Arts chairman Dana Gioia. Dana Gioia, by the way, called Cordle simply to congratulate him and to wish him Godspeed. Gioia was a fan. Poetry, as a quote, confirms what anyone involved in poetry over the past 30 years has known for a long, long time, says Neil Bowers, poet and distinguished professor of English at Iowa State University. This is Bowers again. Poetry contests are rigged. The world of poetry, Bowers says, is all about hustle and connection. Truer words were never spoke. And then here's another little bit. Poet and critic William Logan, an English professor at the University of Florida, says, the facts at poetry are mostly right, the tone mostly shrill. Reading it, I feel caught between being grateful and being annoyed. I think Logan hits the nail really on the head. Going back over this story, I couldn't help but be reminded of the recent GameStop scandal, in which sort of trollish, irritating, and in some cases, really not at all admirable amateurs just delivered a absolutely satisfying blow. And in public humiliation on top of it to some just thoroughly despicable elite puppet masters, and it's hard to. One feels no sympathy for the hedge fund managers in that case, but one isn't especially charmed by the GameStop Reddit guys either, and I think poetry was another version of the story. They embarrassed some people who were, for the most part, in need of a little embarrassment, and yet they were themselves sort of nasty and resentful and unpleasant. This is probably the most sober of the the articles on poetry that I found from the time. This is just a little bit from The Contester, Who's Doing What to Keep Them Clean by Kevin Larimer. And this was in Poets and Writers in the July-August 2005 edition. Like it or not, poetry got people talking about some important issues. In response to the increasingly common discussions among the more than 450 members of the Council of Literary Magazines and Presses, Executive Director Jeffrey Leppendorf decided to schedule a series of formal symposia with writers, editors, and publishers in order to establish a set of guidelines for contests, including a code of ethics, which he hopes to publish on the CLMP website this fall. Those symposia did go ahead, and the CLMP did put out some guidelines. Even beyond that, though, I think the public fuss and embarrassment had been bright, hot, and loud enough that, especially as new poetry book contests emerged, it became increasingly the norm that one announce the judge ahead of time and explicitly prohibit the kind of nepotism that had taken place before. So in that sense, poetry really got its wish. The Jorie Graham brand of poetry contest squirreliness is deeply out of favor, and in most cases explicitly prohibited today. That is not, at any rate, the way in which poetry book contests are squirrely for the most part anymore. But I also think this doesn't quite solve the problem. They got their wish, and yet, what has the result been? Well, you would expect that if the problem were simply that, rather than the best manuscripts being chosen, there were simply the manuscripts of those who knew the judges. You would expect that once that option was eliminated, once the judges had to choose blind or choose only among writers they didn't know, you would expect that if all of Cordle's assessments of the poetry world were accurate, you would expect then that book contest winning books would suddenly become much better. And I don't think anybody would argue that they have. The book contests are more transparent than before, and I think that's good. But the books aren't really much better, and I don't know that I would say they're being chosen for any more worthwhile reasons. And this is where I want to offer a little bit of a defense of Jorie Graham. Now, she defended herself in a couple of ways. She said, for one thing, that she has taught a lot of fucking people. So, if you get on her case every time she chooses a student, she's been a teacher for decades. As to my knowledge, she's still a teacher. So her former students are number in the thousands, and the poetry world is small. And for that matter, if you could use the argument that Rebecca Wolf used when she was challenged. She was the founder of Fence magazine. She was challenged about the preponderance of Iowa grads who appeared in the pages of Fence, and her, very simple, if not necessarily watertight explanation was that the preponderance of Iowans proves only that those of us who judge these contests are in some kind of agreement with those who make the decisions about who goes to the Iowa Writers' Workshop. That is, ostensibly the Iowa Writers' Workshop is where the best poets go, and we are interested in publishing the best poets, and so a lot of the names on those two lists are going to overlap. Jorie Graham might say that she's taught some of the best students at some of the best schools, and so when she is choosing winners, not only because she has a lot of students, but because her students are overrepresented among the best of poets, she might argue it's only reasonable that her students should often be the winners of these prizes, even when she is the one judging. Another, I think, very reasonable defense she made of herself was that she didn't break any rules. These choices, these selections were not against the rules at the time. It was sort of, if anything, it was sort of the done thing. Now, there were at least a couple of cases in which she seemed to take efforts to conceal her choice, or she got Ben Ramke, for example, to take the credit for choosing Peter Sachs, who later she went on to marry, which is, suggests at least that she knew it wouldn't look great. But, the other way of looking at the Jorie Graham rule is that she didn't break it because it didn't exist until afterward. So I think that there is another sort of subtler defense that I could offer of her. And this is, so in the case of the Peter Sachs, who, she awarded him the prize for the contemporary poetry series. He went on to be her colleague and eventually husband up in Cambridge. So not only was he an intimate of Graham's, but he didn't even enter the contest. The story goes that she actually had Ramke solicit Sachs's manuscript and then chose it. Now, the other half of the scandal in that particular case, and I think maybe the best reason for Ramke having to step down from his post. Ramke, by the way, very interesting poet. Hands down the worst poetry reader I've ever heard. Ever. Amazing. Not poetry voice, by the way. Just a high, reedy, limping voice that just seemed to drift around the room like a stunned animal, aimlessly, with no sense of direction or purpose or even an emotional connection to the subject matter. But again, on the page, the poems are pretty interesting. But I think the biggest scandal in that story was not that Graham chose her, soon-to-be husband. It was that Ramke admitted that at least half of the submissions were never read at all. And that is a big deal, I think, and even a big deal, all things considered. Because the solicited entry has a little bit of a tradition to it. John Ashbery was an early and very notable winner of the Yale Younger Poets Prize. He didn't enter the Yale Younger Poets Prize. Auden was judging it. Auden judged it for a number of years. He also selected Adrian Rich another year. But Auden was judging it that year. He had read the entries and he did not like them. He was then on Fire Island and he ran into John Ashbery, had a conversation with him, got along with him. I think they talked about poetry. And he solicited Ashbery's manuscript and then awarded it the prize. This is not to say that Ashbery didn't deserve it, but it is to say that there is a... So as Larimer points out, in 1997, W.S. Merwin announced he had been chosen as the judge of the Yale Younger Poets Prize. Usually it's a 2-year term, sometimes longer. But he was the judge in 1997, and his announcement was, there will be no winner. I read no manuscripts that I thought were deserving. And people, if there's anything that aspiring poets hate more than seeing somebody's boyfriend win a prize, it is seeing nobody win that prize. People fucking hate that. And so it is perhaps understandable if Graham had read all of these entries and found them all wanting, but decided that she wanted to give the prize to somebody who wrote good poetry, then she solicited work. Now, it is that's not what happened in this case, because Ramke said half the entries weren't read at all. But there were other cases in which Graham solicited work, and I think that's at least a reasonable, if not thoroughly satisfying explanation. But I think that that question of a deserving winner or good poetry really is, as I said, it's sort of at the heart of the matter. Again, that parenthetical that Cordle took so for granted was on the basis of potential aesthetic compatibility between him, and the judge. The reason it is so hard for judges to choose correctly, wisely, well books to win these prizes is that there is almost no agreement on what makes a good poem. I mean, almost none. On top of that, there are just staggering numbers of poets writing today. I'm not among those who complain that, back in the old days, poetry was good and now it's bad. There's always been bad poetry, and the majority of poetry has always been bad. But as has been celebrated in some cases, there is more poetry today than ever, and even beyond the proportional terms, even beyond just the growth in population, which is astronomical. There are more people writing poetry today, and more people writing poetry with less and less sense even of what would be anybody's idea of a good poem. And so I think it is increasingly common that insofar as one develops any sense of what makes for a good poem, what makes a poem pleasing or virtuous, however you'd like to determine it, that sensibility, that aesthetic, as Cordle puts it, that those grounds for judgment tend to be developed in a circle of intimates, which then leads to the fairly predictable conclusion that when one looks out at the poetry world and seeks work of value, one tends to find it mostly among the intimates with whom one developed one's whole sense of what makes poetry good to begin with. It's a problem, and it's why I think, I have never been the final judge of any poetry prize, and God willing, I never will be, because it is a another thing Graham said at the time was that is a thankless fucking job. It is not a fun job, and you make one person tops. Best case scenario, you make one person very happy, and a lot of other people hate your fucking guts. So I've never been in that position. I've never been the final judge of a poetry contest, but I have in several other cases been a preliminary reader, intermediary reader, somewhere along the way making, winnowing things down for the final judge. And my observation has been that almost every contest is conducted in pretty good faith. But there are, two big problems. One is that there's just too much stuff. There's too much. And so there's a kind of a clerical fatigue and overload, either just in the filing system, computerized or otherwise, or personally, individually, it is exhausting to read such an enormous bulk of poetry, and it doesn't make one better at reading. The same is true for slush piles generally. But by the way, and this is a little bit of a digression, but slush pile is not a derogatory term. There's this weird little micro fad of editors lately, editors and agents, I've noticed in like more fiction circles, taking a stand and saying, I don't use the word slush pile because I have too much respect for the writers who submit to use a term like that. Fucking what does that mean? That's ridiculous. It is a slush pile. Anyone who's read from a slush pile knows what it is. We all submit to them. They're slush piles. That's just a descriptive term of the big, slushy, slippery heap of virtual or physical papers from lots of people from whom you did not solicit work, but who would like your eye on their work nonetheless. Just because this nonsense about not using the word slush pile is not. I'm not impressed, and I don't believe for a second that you have any special respect for the writers who contribute to those slush piles, which is what they're fucking called. But this is the same problem as judging contests, and beyond that, because there's so many submissions, and they're you could say they're so bad, but you could also say they're so hard to assess at all, because no three people in poetry share a ruler on this stuff. But because of this bulk and because of this fatigue, even if, say, manuscripts are submitted blind, there's seldom enough manpower to for the individual personnel to remain consistently blind in the way that would lead to a sort of a perfect theoretical, rigorously impersonal assessment of content. The reality is that you probably got your manuscript chosen because you happen to include the word semen, or because somebody had a good lunch, or because somebody else got bored and tossed the rest of the stack early that day. So we live in a world that is less corrupt by poetry standards, but I'm not sure, and this is something I respect about Cordle and company, is that they did from the beginning emphasize their ultimate commitment to the art form, what they were most concerned about, and what they were most concerned that what they called poetry harmed was poetry itself. And poetry was retired in 2007, but there were a couple of attempts to resuscitate some version of it. Post Poetry was a website for a little while. There is now a new incarnation of the poetry crowd's online voice. And that is a blog called SLEERICKETS, which is named after the Poetry Foundation's utterly dreary and tedious and useless blog, Harriet. So SLEERICKETS is, find their about page. SLEERICKETS is a poetry and culture blog of original poems and original provocative essays, well known for its Poetry's Hot 100, March Madness Tournament, virtual poetry competition, blah, blah, blah. Boy, they go on. The guys don't like to edit. Long sentences, long paragraphs, long articles. God damn, their about page, I forgot about this. It goes on for fucking ever. So, SLEERICKETS is full of a lot of bad writing, but it's also got some charm to it, and certainly has some of the old bite and spleen of the classic poetry days. But it seems maybe a little more than, poetry was a big fucking bullseye on the poetry world, and SLEERICKETS, filled with terrible poetry as it is. Poetry, by the way, I say this is almost exclusively poetry. It's seemingly, I may be incorrect here, but seemingly it is poetry by the editors, who are enthusiastic and bad. But it seems to be a website that is that is concerned more with poetry than with the poetry world, and I was charmed. Their poetry Hot 100 is this sort of, it's almost like the Time magazine's influential people. It's a list of 100 poets who are hot for a variety of reasons. Clearly, not all of the same polarity. Some are beloved of SLEERIKKETS editors, and some are decidedly not. I was pleased to see my friend Alan Shapiro, the really great and underrated poet Alan Shapiro, made the Hot 100 at SLEERIKKETS this year. That was nice. But even more heartening than that, they included another list of 100. This was a list of the 100 best lines of the past year, best poetry lines of the past year, and these seem to be sincere choices. A. Stallings, somewhat unsurprisingly, got the #1 spot, if I recall. I think. Oh shit, that may be wrong. I think that's true. I think she got the #1 spot. She was either 1 or 2. But also on the list was a line by Jorie Graham, which confirms me that I think that Cordle and company were genuine in their professed devotion to poetry above all. That it is not, for them at least, and this is maybe a demonstration of their rejection to the death of nepotism and all of its kind. But it was a little heartwarming for me to see. At any rate, I want to close this sort of long, somewhat gloomy look at the poetry world with on a slightly lighter note, though maybe with the same grim moral to it. So I mentioned last week the development of a curious subspecies of YouTube video. This was ASMR in last week's show. This week, I have been thinking about another sort of minor variety of YouTube video, and this is the reaction video. That is a video, the subject of which is not the original song, show, image, work of art, or live footage of real events. The subject is not the original subject that gave the occasion for the video. It is the reaction to that subject. So I know there's a popular channel that shows young children reacting to classic rock songs. There's certainly plenty of jump scare reaction videos. Parents love to film and distribute always slightly exploitative feeling videos of their children responding with delight to the sudden presentation of usually some sort of awful Disney product. But the reaction video that's been on my mind this week is to an amateur rap video. So this is here. The video is listed on YouTube as "Rappers React to Rich Brian," featuring Ghostface Killah. So this was a little amateur video shot by a few suburban teenagers in Indonesia. It was a 16-year-old amateur rapper who had a different name at the time that caused a little bit of fuss afterward, and so he currently goes by Rich Brian, but he put out this little video for his song called "Dat Stick," and then this is not that video. This is a video of a bunch of established rappers, including Ghostface Killah, Cameron, Designer, Flatbush Zombies, Goldlink. It is a video of these established rappers reacting to Rich Brian's video. Now, Rich Brian is scrawny and sort of dopey looking, and in the video he wears a pink, buttoned up polo shirt with khaki shorts and a Reebok fanny pack. He is not intimidating to look at, and his dance style is probably could best be described as inadvertently comical. But what is delightful about this video, and I recommend it. I'll put a link to it in the show notes. What's delightful about it is that the rappers sort of, smirk at his silly appearance, and in some cases kind of wonder aloud why they're watching this goofy, scrawny, Indonesian kid, really young kid. Up until the moment when he opens his fucking mouth. And as soon as he does, he delivers a breathtaking stream of just brutal, fluent, dazzling, undeniable gangster rap. As one of the rappers remarks, this is the hardest rapper of all time. He uses another word in place of rapper, but it is absolutely impressive. And it's immediately apparent to the rappers. Now, they may make fun of how he looks. In most cases, they actually, embrace his, slightly incongruous appearance. But whether or not you like gangster rap, whether or not that is a subgenre of this art form that interests you, what is clear is that he can do it. He's really good at it. It's clear to all of them. They're not even necessarily rappers who all practice the art form in the same way as each other, but it is clear to all of them that he knows what he's doing, that he can do this thing. It's a really fun video to watch. I do recommend it, and it's a catchy song. Dat Stick. It's a very short, very snappy little classic gangster rap song. I mean, very, very impressive. But what made me a little sad, thinking about this video recently, is the realization that you could never do a video like this for poetry. Not just because poetry is not, the poetry we're talking about, I guess, is not a purely performative medium. The performance of rap, the flow, is a major part of what makes rap work or not. For spoken word poetry, sure, you could do a video like this. But for poetry that is meant to survive even without the help of performance. It's not that you can't perform sort of serious, I hate distinctions like literary, but it's not that you couldn't perform serious literary poetry in a charming or stirring way. It's just that part of what defines the endeavor is that the work be able to survive even without the help of that performance. And that's something you could not put together a collection of poets, even among the same little sub category of contemporary poetry. You couldn't find 5 poets, sit them down, and present them with a poem, and get this kind of immediate recognition, this immediate consensus. Not necessarily that it's the best, not necessarily that every question of it is resolved, but simply that, oh, obviously this is the real deal. Because in poetry, nobody knows what the real deal is anymore. It's just not part of the conversation. But this has been a long segment, and I think we've talked enough about the bad news. So let's skip now to a tiny bit of farewell good news before we call this show a show for the week. I mentioned the slush pile earlier, and I thought I ought to say, since it's such a rare experience, that I still read a slush pile today. And this week I found something. It's pretty unusual to find something from someone you've never heard of. It's not a solicitation or a recommendation, but just a submission in the pile, so to speak. Though this is all email. But I read one out of the blue from a woman I'd never heard of, and it was really good. Not at all my kind of poetry. It's just very evident that she knew what she was doing. That it was impressive. But slush piles so seldom provide occasion for joy, and this was a good one. It was a good week for the slush pile. But that's not the poem I'm going to share with you now. This is a very, very old poem. This is fragment 16 from Sappho. It's been translated many times by some terrific poets. This is not the best known or the most elegant or skillful or glamorous translation, but it is my personal favorite. This is the translation by Sherrod Santos, who was one of the poets publicly named and shamed by Alan Cordle. So perhaps appropriate to today's episode. But he translates this into fairly prosy lines, and he gives it the provisional title To Anactoria, because it is a love poem to a woman or a girl named Anactoria. Santos' translation To Anactoria appeared in the volume Greek Lyric Poetry, a new translation from Norton, and that was published in 2005. There's one word I think maybe I ought to define, just in case it's not familiar. At the very end, he uses the word hoplites. Hoplite is a heavily armed ancient Greek foot soldier. So that's all he's talking about. That's all she's talking about, I should say. All right, I'm going to read it and talk maybe for a moment about it, and then maybe read it again, because like most of the poems I read on here, it is pretty short. So this is fragment 16 by Sappho to Anactoria. Some men say it's the site of ramparts fronted by cavalry. Others that it's a field of foot soldiers closing ranks. Still others claim that the heart thrills to no spectacle more than a fleet of warships churning the wine-dark waters white. I say, instead, the presence of what you love is best. This is easy enough to understand. Even the far-famed, milk-skinned Helen abandoned a worthy husband, and, without one thought for child or doting parents, stole away in a deep-sea ship with the destroyer of Troy. And now that you are gone, Anactoria, I know that power. No, deep down, I would rather see your bare feet on these flagstones, your face reflected in a looking-glass, than I would watch the man-killing chariots of Lydia, or the sun-enameled armor of the hoplites in battle. So the poem takes the form of a kind of an argument. There is a word for this particular rhetorical form. The word is priamel or priamel. Priamel is a word that not only have I never heard a human being utter in conversation, but I have barely ever seen it written down in print. It's just not very common in English. I think it was originally a German term. German classicists came up with it, but it's a term for a simple rhetorical structure whereby a set of alternatives is presented with all options being false or not preferred up until the last one. So not this, but this. And this is the structure that Sappho uses here. She says, some men say that it's this site, some men say it's that site, some men say it's another site. I say it's the one you love. So site here is not, this isn't a trivial question. This question of to what site does the heart thrill most? It's not a trivial question because when she's writing this poem, most of these sites she's describing are not at all easily accessible. Aristotle, at the beginning of the Poetics, has this little remark about how it's funny that we take delight in a really accurate drawing of a lion. If you're presented with a really true to life, finely rendered drawing of a lion, it's really pleasing to see, where we feel really gratified by the resemblance. And yet, if an actual lion were close enough for you to see it that finely in that much detail, you would run screaming out of the room. And the kinds of things that she's describing, the sight of battle, the sight of the water getting churned to a froth by the oars of the warships, and you see the water turning that color because the warship is moving fast enough to come ram your ship and punch a hole in it and sink it. These are rare sights. It's that third little stanza where she describes Anactoria, or at least names these little fragments of the woman's image, her bare feet on the flagstones, her face reflected in a looking glass. These are the humblest and simplest images in the poem. Even the reference to Helen has these piled on hyphenates, far-famed, milk-skinned. Anactoria, the beloved in this poem, is the simplest, humblest, least outwardly impressive sight named. And that's part of what I find charming about this poem and about this translation, because it's very plain spoken in its construction, even though the diction, and specifically the images, the nouns in the poem, the noun phrases, are often occur in a high register or with rather unusual or elaborate names. The sun-enameled armor of the hoplites in battle, the fleet of warships churning, the wine-dark waters white, the sight of ramparts fronted by cavalry. The things in this poem are rare and precious and terrifying and exciting, but the logic of the poem is very simple. And even though there is a kind of hyperbole that she offers in saying this very simple and very ordinary experience, you can see bare feet on flagstones any day. You can see a face in a looking glass any day. You can't see these other things any day, and some of us never see them at all if we're living thousands of years ago, when to see them means to be there. There is in her hyperbole even a kind of humility. This is all I want. It is not that it is, the sight of Anactoria, the sight of a bare feet on flagstones or a face in a looking glass is not intrinsically exciting. It's not universally exciting. It's not special or thrilling to everyone, but it is thrilling to Sappho. It is just because she is specifically the person she is that Sappho has this response. And maybe that's part of what I really enjoy about this translation. There's certainly he does nothing to preserve the meter. I can't say what he does to preserve Sappho's syntax or any of the. I don't even know exactly how precise the denotative translation is, though having read a number of others, I think it's fairly accurate. But the humility of the argument, I think, is part of what I find really pleasing about this poem. I'm going to read it through one more time and then close out the show. This is fragment 16 by Sappho to Anactoria, translated by Sharad Santos. Some men say it's the sight of ramparts fronted by cavalry. Others that it's a field of foot soldiers closing ranks. Still others claim that the heart thrills to no spectacle more than a fleet of warships churning the wine-dark waters white. I say, instead, the presence of what you love is best. This is easy enough to understand. Even the far-famed, milk-skinned Helen abandoned a worthy husband, and without one thought for child or doting parents, stole away in a deep-sea ship with the destroyer of Troy. And now that you are gone, Anactoria, I know that power. Know deep down I would rather see your bare feet on these flagstones, your face reflected in a looking-glass. Then I would watch the man-killing chariots of Lydia, or the sun-enameled armor of the hoplites in battle. It is an elegant little trick that he plays with the phrase "the destroyer of Troy." Troy, of course, appearing in the word destroyer, suggesting that Paris carries even in his identity the ultimate fate. there is something, there is a kind of an acceptance of doom, of fate in this poem. Despite her desire, there's definitely a feeling that Sappho has resigned herself to the loss of this woman. And maybe that's why there's so much implied loss and death in all of the imagery. But in any event, it's a beautiful little poem. There are many other good translations, and this may be only my favorite, but that is what it is. So thank you so much for listening. I want to encourage you to write in if you have thoughts, if you have complaints. I'm sure there are plenty after this episode. You can write me at SLEERICKETS@gmail.com, SLEERICKETS@gmail.com. Please also take a moment to subscribe to the show on iTunes, on Stitcher, on Spotify, on a few other platforms as well. Rate the show, review it, maybe even, and just give me a hello. There are a number of different measures I have of the who's listening. They turn out to be wildly inconsistent with each other, so it's actually pretty hard to get a sense of who and how many and if people are listening. So please do let me know if you like what you hear or don't, or whatever else is on your mind. I look forward to hearing from you, and I hope to be speaking with you again very soon. Thanks.